Alright. Wow, how I didn't have the lights off. Oh, okay. Alright. Alright, I guess you guys, you knew this was coming. Alright, for those of you who are not in the loop, this was our introduction to Roya. Okay, so this summer there was we have to all do Title IX training. It's very important. Okay, it's very important, and I think there were some technical difficulties, and some people had trouble like logging into the system, or I don't know. I wasn't really following the thread that much. And things started to get heated, and Roya. Roya CC's her friend and does a reply all to all of GSAS LOL. It was a disaster.
So this is how we are justified. So this was the email sent out. Everyone knows what it's about. And this. And this has become a signature. No, the last one. So last one was when we were discussing what's the events improvement and Charlie should like. Yes. I know, right?
So Roy is great. She, we all take the same classes, and she always asks great questions, right? So that's one of when I think about Roya, something I think about is, wow, this girl's really sharp. She asks great questions. When I think about Roya, I also think about a lot of other things. Like, for example, she's always late. She's always late. You think, oh no, don't worry, it's okay to be 30 minutes late. She'll come an hour late. You'd be like, oh no, don't worry, come an hour late. She'll come 5 hours late. There's she's operating on Nigerian time. I have no idea how she's always this consistently late. So whenever you hear the phrase classic Roya, it could probably be referring to that too. And there's a million instances of her being late. She's just always late. And I think it's really funny because I'm gonna call out Rachel here too, because Rachel in the beginning of the program, she's also late, but she didn't want to get the reputation of being late, so she came early to the very first meeting. And Roya came late to the very first meeting, and now Roya is the one who has the reputation. So you won, Rachel.
And there's more of the same. Roya being late again, and classic Roya.
Speaking of being late. Some of us have places to be at once.
Okay, so if you're early, it's actually known as anti-Roya now. So that's.
All right, we're gonna wrap this up then. Yeah. Because Rochelle told me to. But Roya is actually a fantastic person, a fantastic scientist, and we're honored to have been chosen to introduce her. What?
So Roya also really loves chocolate, as can be seen from that text message. And when you think about it, it makes sense why this is true. Because chocolate has the letters late. So I think everything makes sense now.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Okay. So in life, we all want certain things. I swear, every time I see Lindy outside of lab, he's on his way to buy milk. CJ's bank account really suffers at the expense of her love of shoes, and Jack is always after the elusive Huang resolution. So these things are really easy to find if they're stationary. So we just plug in our locations into Google Maps. So here we see that Lindy is told to walk to the milk and cheese store. CJ is going to take her tea to the shoe store. And Jack actually did fly all the way across the country a few months ago to go to Slack to look at protein dynamics. But this navigation is a lot harder if our objects can fly, which is the truth here. So in this case, the milk, the shoes, and the one angstrom all have wings, and so do CJ, Lindy, and Jack. So to navigate to these, they need a couple different strategies. And in order to implement these strategies, they need to measure two things. So here we have CJ. CJ is this dot in the middle of the coordinate system, and her target is over here. She's going to calculate two angles to get to the target. The first is called the line of sight angle, and this is the compass-bearing angle between herself and her target. So according to a north, south, east, west coordinate system, her lambda line of sight angle is going to be this. The second angle she has to calculate is something called a deviation angle, which is the difference between her velocity vector and that line of sight. And so you see that this delta is relative between her flight direction and the line of sight to the target. So using these two inputs, CJ, Jack, and Lindy are going to navigate to their targets in very different ways. So first, we have Lindy. So Lindy's strategy is something called pure pursuit, where he's going to keep his line of sight angle 0 at all times. So he sees the milk, and he's going to fly straight toward the milk. He has really no foresight about where the milk is going to go. He's just going to fly straight toward it. All right, and as the milk moves along in some other direction that's not his line of sight direction, he's going to correct his path until eventually he intercepts the milk down here. And you see he has a very curved angle, or a curved flight, and at the end he's still turning into his target. You'll also notice that the line of sight angle changes all the time throughout the flight, but that deviation angle is going to remain 0 at all, or sorry, the deviation angle is going to remain 0 at all times. So the difference here is always going to be 0. CJ is a little bit more forward-thinking. So she's going to keep a deviation angle of 45 degrees at all times. And this slide really scares Felix because this is more like 20 degrees, but we'll just pretend it's 45. And you see that at all times, she's going to calculate her line of sight angle, and then she's going to fly 45 degrees to that angle. So even though the line of sight angle is changing, her delta is remaining consistent throughout her entire flight. Finally, we have Jack, who is the most forward-thinking of them all. What he's going to do is he's actually going to try to keep his line of sight angle consistent. So if we draw this line of sight angle back to the reference frame, which is like this north-south coordinates over here, we see that this angle is always the same. And this gives Jack actually a lethal advantage called motion camouflage, which basically means that when the target, one angstrom, is looking back on him at every point, he remains sort of fixed in the background. So he looks like he's maybe part of the mountains or part of the sky. He's not really moving in the field of view of the one angstrom, and so the one angstrom has no idea he's coming. So these strategies might seem kind of ridiculous, but it turns out they're relevant in at least two contexts, the first of which is peregrine falcon hunting, and the second of which is guided missiles. And so that, and probably more, but anyway. So this brings us to our paper here. Terminal attack trajectories of peregrine falcons are described by the proportional navigation guidance law of missiles. And this is done by Caroline Brighton et al. At University of Oxford and published in PNAS. So peregrine falcons are really famous for their record-breaking dives. About a third of the time when they go after their prey, they do sort of like a straight-down dive that reaches speeds up to 200 miles an hour, and this is actually a world record for animals, I believe, in terms of speed. But it turns out that 2/3 of the time, so most of the time, they actually do a lateral attack. So they're actually just following their prey in a lateral plane and sort of banking on the fact that they're going to be faster than their prey. So this paper wanted to look at the trajectories of lateral attacks, and to do so, they put on GPS camera backpacks onto the falcons. So this GPS gives you sort of coordinates of the falcon, and this is kind of weird, but this camera shows you like an over-the-head view of the falcon. So the head is kind of flat, and then you see the eyes, and you see the field of view of the falcon, as well as maybe like the little bird that it's chasing. So one of the goals of this paper was to test a hypothesis from the early 2000s about how falcons might be hunting and which strategy they might use. So this is a downward view of the falcon's head. So these are its eyes, and this is its beak. It turns out that falcons have two areas of their retina where they focus light the best. The first is called the shallow fovea, and it's at about a 15-degree off angle from the beak. And it turns out that falcons focus here when they're looking at things less than 8 meters away. Then there's the deep fovea with a 45-degree angle, and they focus here when they're looking at things greater than 21 meters away. And so this led scientists to hypothesize that they would use CJ's strategy of keeping a 45-degree deviation angle at all times. And this sometimes can result in them actually spiraling toward their target in order to maintain that 45-degree angle. So this argument was made purely on the basis of anatomy and aerodynamics, and was not made on the basis of any sort of feedback law. But immediately the researchers of this paper saw that this hypothesis was incorrect. So if we look at sort of a stationary mallard target here, we have here an aerial view of the falcon's flight, longitude and latitude, and we're looking down on this trajectory. We see that the line of sight angle is constantly changing, and the deviation angle delta is constantly changing as it approaches its duck target. So it starts out really big, and then eventually goes to 0. So automatically we see that there's no one geometric rule that can describe all of this trajectory. Instead, there are two guidance laws that might be able to describe it. So the first one is something called proportional navigation, and this is actually what's used in guided missiles. So proportional navigation basically means that you have some sort of gain in your turning rate according to the turning rate of the line of sight. And let's just walk through this. So say we launch our missile M directly at our target, T. The missile is first, its velocity vector is sort of right along that line of sight vector, and you're going to have no deviation angle. But let's say that the target is moving in this direction. Eventually it's going to end up here, and the line of sight angle is going to shift with some acceleration. What the missile is going to do is it's going to turn faster than that line of sight angle is turning. So you're going to end up getting a bigger deviation angle. Does that make sense to people? Okay. And so the equation for that is given by the turning rate equals the line of sight rate times some gain, which is n. And what's interesting about this n value is that it can actually describe all three of the strategies we saw from Lindy's, CJ, and Jack. So here we have Lindy's trajectory, and we see that he actually has an n value of 1. So he has no gain on his turning. He's going to turn exactly as the target is turning. So this is n equals 1 with a delta 0 of 0. So he's not going to have any gain on the turning. He's just going to follow the target. CJ is also going to have an n equals 1, but she's going to have a delta 0 that's greater than 0. So she's going to have the same lead angle at all times. Both of those vectors are going to turn at the same rate, and that lead angle is going to be maintained. Jack has a really big n value, maybe n equals 5. And what that means is that his turning is actually going to completely drown out the turning rate of the line of sight, so it's almost as if the line of sight is not changing. And that's how he's able to maintain this sort of parallel line of sight throughout his whole flight. So the second model that can explain these trajectories is something called proportional pursuit. And this happens when, say your missile is going at some direction off of its line of sight. What it's going to try to do is it's going to try to close that delta so that it becomes 0 eventually. So it's continually going to minimize the delta. So it's going to turn until that delta is 0. And this is given by the turning rate equals some negative constant times the delta, and this drives delta t to 0. And just to help you guys keep track, if it gets a little confusing, those are kind of the main points of the model. So to compare them, proportional pursuit, you're homing in, you're driving that delta to 0. Proportional navigation, which was the first one, you're turning with some gain. And with a gain of 5, like Jack, you're going to get motion camouflage. But also remember that you're turning so fast that if you make any sort of error in the line of sight calculation, that error is going to be amplified. So you need like a really sort of rigorous system for n of 5 to work. So this is sort of the trade-off. And this paper is seeking to ask whether either of these models fit, and if it's proportional navigation, they want to see whether the falcons use a high gain value or a low gain value. So they have 8 falcons. They have 26 flights where the researcher is sort of tossing up a bird-like object and the falcon is swooping in to grab it laterally. They have 35 flights where a drone is actually carrying a spinning bird-like object in the air, and the falcon comes over and snatches the bird off of the string. These videos are really incredible. And then because these falcons need to eat and they just happen to be wearing the backpacks, they also caught trajectories from 12 live flights where the falcon was trying to get food. So once they have all of these trajectories, they do the following analysis. They simulate each trajectory with the best fitting value of N or K, depending on proportional navigation or proportional pursuit. They minimize prediction error to 1%, which is sort of like the difference between their simulation and the actual trajectory. So here, maybe in pink, we have a 2% error that fits a lot more of the data than the 1% error, but they're going to throw out the 2% fit and only use the fits with less than or equal to 1% prediction error. Then they actually don't know when the peregrine falcon is starting its attack. So initially, it might just be circling, it might not see the target yet. So what they have to do is actually analyze all possible start times because they don't know when that attack is starting. And they're going to report the simulation with the longest fit as long as that error is less than or equal to 1%. So here, it's really easy to fit a short trajectory. It's a little bit harder as that trajectory gets longer. But as long as this longest one has a prediction error less than 1%, they're going to report this value. And finally, they're going to report fits for only the 15 trajectories with the most turning. So it turns out that it's really easy to fit any model to these straight flights, geometric or navigational or whatever. It's also really easy within each model to fit any parameter. So these flights are actually not useful at all in distinguishing models, and they have to use these in order to make sure that that model is challenged and would be rigorous. So here are the results. For trajectory fits with less than or equal to 1% prediction error, proportional navigation wins with 46 out of 55 that they tried, while proportional pursuit only fits 35 out of 55. So proportional navigation, remember, is when you have a gain on your turning. And this is actually really, really cool, some of the fits that they found. So here is a cool example with a duck and a falcon. And this is actually quite a complicated trajectory. So what happens here is that the falcon is tracking this duck. It makes a first pass and it misses. The duck keeps going, the falcon turns around and does this really tight turn and then intercepts the duck here. And that's really impressive, and you would imagine that it would be really hard to fit a model to all this turning, but it turns out that the proportional navigation model can do just that. So that's a really impressive fit, and that's really exciting. And the values they gained from fitting this model, they have a fit duration of about 5 seconds, a median of 5 seconds, a length of fit about 114 meters, and this range might be biological. So it's possible that the falcon is starting maybe 50 meters into its trajectory, or maybe it started 200 meters away. So this part of this range might be biological, and some of it might be from error. Also, their median gain value is about 2.6, and it falls within the range of 1.3 to 3.2. But this is actually kind of surprising because it turns out that missiles use a much higher gain value range. They use a range of 3 to 5. And remember, that's more like what Jack does than what CJ or Lindy would do. So what are the pros and cons of a high or low gain value, and why might falcons use a low gain value? So we already know the pros of a high gain value, like what Jack has. So he has motion camouflage. He also has error amplification. So that's the trade-off for him. For missiles, what's really important about an N equals 5 is that it straightens upon arrival. So remember that Jack took a relatively straight path, whereas Lindy was constantly turning into his target. And it turns out that because missiles have really stubby wings, they can't really make that turn, that tight turn into their target very easily. So it's important for them to be straight at the end. The pros and cons of a lower gain value are kind of the opposite. So it amplifies less error. And in a biological system like falcons, you can imagine that they would have a lot more error calculation because all they're using is their field of view, whereas missiles have things like radar and other ways of telling where their objects are, where their targets are. So it's possible that in biological systems you just have more error and a lower gain value might be better. So the cons of a low gain value for missiles is actually that you have really high centripetal acceleration. So remember again that Lindy was turning really tightly into his target. That's really hard for a missile to do. It turns out though that falcons are just much lighter than missiles, and so that centripetal, yeah, in case you didn't know. So that centripetal acceleration is a lot easier. And it also turns out that they can make those sharper turns because of the biology of their wings. So they have much more dexterous wings, they can break and turn much more easily. And it turns out that that acceleration they experience is less than or equal to 2.5 Gs for falcons, which is not that much, and it really pales in comparison to what a missile would experience. So the takeaways of this paper are that there's no one simple geometric rule based on anatomy. Instead, we have some sort of guidance law that can produce multiple geometries depending on the maneuvering of the target. This guidance law is great because it requires very little information. All it requires is calculating the line of sight angle and the deviation angle. And you can imagine that as a falcon, that's really good because what they can distinguish is where they're going and where the angle at which their target is going. What would be hard for a falcon to calculate is how fast their target is moving and how far away their target is. Those are just really hard to do when all you have are vision. All you have is vision. And finally, falcon trajectories may prioritize error reduction over motion camouflage, but that's still a hypothesis. And it might explain why they have a low gain value in their fits. So for future directions of this paper, it would be really, really interesting to see whether falcons optimize their end value according to their or their target's behavior. So what we see is that gain value takes a range between, I forget, 1.4 and 3.2, and they tried to correlate that range to things like the type of target the falcon was hunting and the speed of the falcon, and neither of those yielded any correlation. But there are tons of other variables at play that might be correlated with that. So that would be a really cool future direction. And then another one is whether falcons or other species use this guidance law for related behaviors. And finally, is this strategy actually optimal for catching prey? So it might be really good for navigating to prey, but actually the 12 live catches that they found, none of them were successful. So you could ask, would a higher gain value with more motion camouflage, would that make the falcon more successful in actually capturing its prey? Are there other factors than simply navigating toward the prey? So critiques of this paper, the first one is a lot like Rockwell's, which is that they really didn't show much data analysis. So they showed a lot of trajectory fits for proportional navigation, but they didn't show any for proportional pursuit or proportional navigation variance. They also didn't show their data analysis for proportional pursuit, so it's really hard to actually compare that raw data. Also, a question we had was whether trajectories of the fits overlap or don't overlap. So for example, we were given that proportional navigation fits 46 trajectories and proportional pursuit fits 35 trajectories. But is this 35 included in the 46, or are they sort of distinct, and might the falcon switch off between strategies? And finally, does it actually make sense to look at the longest fit? Because again, we have no way of knowing when a falcon starts to attack. So this is kind of a decision that the researchers made, but we can debate as to whether it was a good one. So I'd like to thank my coaches, Felix, Annie, and Florian. And take any questions you guys have. Yeah, Sean. Oh, boss.
So are these videos in the supplemental?
Yes. They're really cool. They're really cool, yeah.
Finally get your duck.
So do you know if the different types of catches, throwing the thing or the drone or the live ones, if the proportional pursuit versus what was the other one? Sorry.
Proportional navigation.
If they sort of sorted into
Yeah.
what target they were attacking.
That's a really good question. They didn't do that analysis, but in the supplement, they have all the raw data. Unfortunately, they don't tell us which trajectories they actually analyzed, so it's kind of hard to say, but that would be a really good question as well.
One more question.
Yeah, Nicole.
Do I need to edit that? Okay. I assume that the GPS backpacks that we're wearing were kind of heavy. Okay.
Okay. So I could assume that the GPS backpacks that they were using could be heavy. Do you know if that affected the accuracy or behavior of the falcons in any way? Did they do any controls of that?
I didn't see any controls for that. Something they did do was they forced the models to fit the actual velocity of the falcons who are wearing the backpacks. So either way, the models fit the data that they had. And that's a really good, that's a really good question because you can also imagine that they're not aerodynamically favorable, that they're a little bit heavier. I don't know.
Yeah. And then one quick other question. Did they say anything about individual falcons being better than others?
That's it.
And what was the aim? Like, what was the aim and actual aim of those falcons?
They didn't do that. I presented this to my friends in the English department, and they were like, these biology studies are crazy. Everyone's different. Everyone's individual. And I was like, not always. But yeah, so that's a great question. I wish they'd done that. They have all of that in the raw data. So if you want to do the analysis yourself, you're welcome.